If you were drawing a diagram of the countries that have done the most for Ukraine, with helpful neighbors like the Czech Republic over here and professional saboteurs like Hungary being way over there somewhere, you'd be hard-pressed to find a country that could be placed closer to the helpful side than Great Britain. While the United States has supplied way more weapons and Poland has taken way more refugees, the UK has been one of the most proactive on the international stage, corralling support for Kyiv as it fights off Russian invasion. And it's not just in the field of diplomacy that Britain has had Ukraine's back. Training, weapons deliveries, and now the recently announced initiative to invest $600 million in low-cost drone production to help hold Ukraine's front line. Basically, if it'll frustrate the vampire in the Kremlin, the UK's there for it. So, we decided to go straight to the source and find out how much longer London can keep this up. John Healey is the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defence and a guy who has been outspoken in his support for Ukraine. And as you're about to see, he's also a hardcore believer in the idea that NATO must act when threatened by Russia, which lines up nicely with what we as a channel have been banging on about for years. We invited him on, and to our surprise, he said yes. And what followed is a pretty fascinating conversation about drone warfare, standing up to Putin, and how a sovereign Ukraine keeps all of Europe safe. And look, I'll be honest, I was a little nervous about this interview. This dude's a pretty big deal in my country, but I don't think it comes across too much, hopefully. Anyway, let us know what you think and if there's anyone else you'd like us to interview one day. And now, here is the UK's Secretary of Defence on our little YouTube channel. Hi, morning.
It's John Healey here. Good morning to you.
Pleasure to meet you, John. Thank you for joining us. Shall we just jump straight into it?
Yeah, no, sure. They tell me you're based in the Czech Republic.
That's right. I live in Prague.
Facing a bit of turmoil there, Simon, after the election.
Somewhat. Somewhat, yeah. I think a lot of people here saw it coming somewhat. I think Babiš was kind of on the path in, and yeah, the election kind of went as a lot of people expected, but turmoil nonetheless.
It was reflected yesterday at the defence ministers of NATO, where you had your outgoing sort of Czech defence minister essentially sort of signing off. Got a round of applause.
Yes, indeed.
You know, I think the outgoing government's very clearly sort of signalled what to expect given the outcome of the election, particularly in relation to Ukraine.
I think so. It'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. And I'd love to ask you about that and just introduce you to our audience. We have a very international audience. A lot of Americans watch this show. And obviously, you are the Secretary of Defence for the United Kingdom, Mr. John Healey. Pleasure to have you with us.
Really happy to do it for the first time. I don't really want to get into local Czech politics, but...
No, good.
You know, Simon's based in the Czech Republic, so I
love it.
That because it was very striking yesterday, actually.
Yeah, no, I appreciate them giving a brief introduction to me. That's very nice. I wanted to start off light with a question for you. Thought, light, Russia, what happens next with peace? I'm wondering, there's been a lot of talk of the coalition of the willing, the UK, France, others coming together to play a role in post-war Ukraine. I was wondering where you see that going. What role do you see for British troops playing in that, and maybe their positioning in Ukraine, whether that's something that they'd be placed further east or west in the country? Just wondering what your thoughts are around that for the future.
Sure. From a British perspective and a starting point, the UK remains united for Ukraine. Cross-party, strong public support, many thousands of British families still hosting Ukrainian refugee women and children in this country. As a new government elected last year, we're now spending the highest ever level of military funding on military aid to Ukraine this year, £4.5 billion. And you've seen also, as a new government, Britain step up to take over the leadership and coordinating of the Ukraine contact group. I chaired that with Boris Pistorius from Germany yesterday in NATO headquarters, 50 nations coming together to step up support for Ukraine. And you've also seen, alongside the French, the UK step forward to put together the coalition of the willing, so that as the international nations committed to standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Our job is to keep Ukraine in the fight now and to fight back the Russian invasion, to prepare to secure the peace for tomorrow, hence the coalition of the willing and the development of security guarantees that would give President Zelensky the confidence to go into negotiations, and then to stand ready on all fronts to step up to do more as required.
Absolutely. And specifically after peace, whatever that might look like, do you see British troops being in Ukraine in the future?
Well, the Prime Minister's been very clear, and he was, I think, the first Western leader to say this. Look, he would be willing to see British boots on the ground in Ukraine after a ceasefire as part of an international force that could help to regenerate Ukrainian armed forces and also reassure the Ukrainian people. So if needed, he's been willing to say that from the start.
Absolutely. Do you think part of that reassurance is in the form of perhaps a tripwire, if you will, for Russia? So if Russia does violate any sort of peace agreements and ends up, doing something to British troops in the country, do you think that will act as a sort of tripwire for Russia and Putin to, know that this far, no further?
None of the international discussions, none of the military planning has been based on that quite old-fashioned concept of a tripwire force located along the 1,000+ miles of Ukrainian-Russian border. In the end, the strongest defense and deterrence of Ukraine in the future against any future Russian aggression is the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces itself, and hence the emphasis, if you like, on the leadership and the preparation to support the regeneration of armed forces in Ukraine after the end of the fighting. By the way, a military which is probably the best, some of the most flexible, and certainly using some of the most, and developing constantly some of the most innovative weaponry and systems that we have certainly anywhere within Europe. And interestingly, and this became clear in the discussions in Brussels yesterday, for the first time, an argument I wanted to make and have made, which is that there's no security for Europe in the future without a strong and sovereign Ukraine. But Ukraine, post this war, will be a strong contributor to wider European security. And what we've started to see now is NATO training exercises with Ukrainian experts being able to help those NATO exercises train and deal with the very battlefield conditions that Ukraine is dealing with now. And what we saw when, for instance, Denmark hosted a couple of weeks ago the European political community and was concerned about the drone incursions into its own airports.
Yes.
Certainly the UK responded with our experts to go in and help the Danes, but so did the Ukrainians. They sent in specialist personnel, they sent in some of their radars, and they sent in some of their counter-drone systems. So you've started to see a mindset rightly being established, I think, amongst the, let's call it shorthand Western nations, the 50+ nations, not just in Europe, but across the world that were there and willing to support Ukraine. Not just seeing Ukraine as a fight that we must see them win and prevent Putin prevailing, but starting to see how potentially strong a contribution Ukraine can make to our wider security in the future. And that's, I think, an important part of reinforcing the commitment to this Ukrainian fight 3.5 years into this brutal invasion. And of course, a war that Putin thought he'd win within a week.
3.5 years into a 3-day special military operation, as we often say on the channel. I want to ask there about drone technology. I think that can relate a lot to what Ukraine's been developing. I think definitely Ukraine would be seen as a leader in drone technology these days. And, you mentioned there about British troops on the ground in Ukraine, training, working together with NATO allies, all of this stuff. Do you think there's something to be done with Ukraine in terms of military technology? Drones seem to be this a sea change in how. Would you agree with that? Do you think this is a sea change in how we're doing battle in the future, or do you think drones might be, we have them today, we'll counter them tomorrow, and then we'll go back to how we've been doing things for decades?
That question is not a will. That question is an is.
Okay.
You can't be in Ukraine with members of their armed forces or those actually brave civilians working in drone factories. When I was in Kyiv last month, I visited a drone factory that had been bombed 5 times this year alone. And those workers were turning up to work every day because they know that what they do is keeping their sons, fathers, uncles, friends in the fight. And you can't see the way that they tell us and show us how the innovation cycle requires them to update and upgrade what they do every 6 to 8 weeks, because the Russians found ways of dealing with it and countering it without saying, of course there are lessons. And that's happening already.
The fiber optic thing was fascinating to me, where they were just like, how do we counter the fact that they can jam? Oh, we'll run a wire to the drones in the sky. Something I'd never even think of, and there they are.
The really impressive fact is they're doing this fast. They're doing this with enormous flexibility and ingenuity. And they're doing this very often at low cost and relatively low tech. They're just putting things together in a way that demonstrates to us that our way of conceiving our military requirements, our way of procuring our military requirements fundamentally needs to change. Now, I think you've covered in the past what the UK has led with what we've called Task Force Kindred. This has been the ability for the UK to be the leading edge in procuring much of what Ukraine has needed from the start. But we've demonstrated for ourselves now that we can do this in the UK in a different way, much more effectively. And then in that question of the learning, for the first time in warfare history, the majority of casualties on both sides, being killed and badly injured, is by drones. It's not artillery. Yes. It's not the heavy fire that we've seen in the past. And when your casualty rate is 3/4+ from drones, and you see the way that technology is changing the nature of warfare, you have to say, well, look, if we're faced with a fight in the future, it won't be exactly the same as Ukraine, but it won't certainly be the same as the sort of fighting that we've been used to and we've been planning for in the past. So the challenge for me is to say not just how can we now help Ukraine accelerate their ability to innovate and produce what they need, but how can we take that and use it to make sure that our own forces in the UK and with NATO allies have what they also need. So several weeks ago, just signed with the new Ukrainian Defense Minister, Minister Shamal, an agreement that for the first time, Ukraine will share some of their IP on one of their most effective interceptor drones, Octopus. We are now going to develop that rapidly in the next few weeks together in the UK and mass produce that. So we will bring our UK technological expertise, our capability to use mass production techniques to develop a new improved interceptor drone, produce it at scale, get it back in the thousands each month into the hands of Ukrainian fighters. We'll clearly have to upgrade that as required because of the challenges of the way that Russia operate. But we'll also be able to take that, supply and train and equip our own forces and potentially other forces with that sort of drone technology. And we've seen why that's so important with some of the incursions that we've seen recently on the wider eastern flank from Russia into Poland, into Romania, into Estonia.
And speaking of those incursions, I know we only have a couple of minutes remaining. How much further does Russia have to push before more action's taken? I was thinking about this, and people often comment in our videos. We found out what happens when a NATO nation shoots down a Russian fighter with Turkey in 2015. And the sentiment, at least among my audience, seems to be that NATO's not pushing back hard enough. Do you think there'll be a point when we push back harder, or do you think this is going to fade away? Where do you see the future of that being? What do you think NATO's stance should be?
Well, first of all, Putin must be in no doubt that if NATO is threatened, we will act. And secondly, I think we saw a strong, rapid and firm NATO reaction, including within days, British jets reinforcing the NATO Eastern Sentry patrolling of the eastern flank in Poland and beyond. For me, it's really less important about whether these incursions are deliberate or unintentional. Mm-hmm. They are Putin's responsibility. He is looking to test us. He's looking to distract and divide us, distract us from Ukraine, divide us in the response that we make. And what we had in NATO headquarters at the defense ministers and at the UDCG meeting yesterday that I chaired with Boris Pistorius was very clearly NATO ready to step up, NATO responding, as we saw in recent weeks with Poland and Estonia, responding to deter and responding to unite. And the problem for Putin is that he is now weaker than he was before he launched his invasion into Ukraine. Yeah. NATO is stronger and bigger with this extraordinary commitment we've all made in June at the Hague summit, that by 2035, we'll be spending, each and every nation, 5% on wider national security as well as core defense. And so Putin's invasion of Ukraine is entirely counterproductive to the basic long-term aims that he has. And, this is tough. It's a tough period for Ukraine. It's important that they know, as I think we demonstrated to Minister Shamal yesterday, that the nations that stand with Ukraine will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We'll help them in the fight now, and we will need to step that up. And we're ready to help secure the future if we can get Putin to the negotiating table. And that will be a matter of keeping Ukraine strong on the battlefield, but also strengthening the pressure on Putin, not just to talk, but to negotiate. And one of the important features was that the Americans were a big part of the defense ministers' discussions yesterday at NATO, and a big part also of the discussions at the UDCG.
Yes, agreed on all fronts, I think, especially about just the idea Putin starts a war in Ukraine because he's concerned about NATO, and now he should be even more concerned about NATO, it seems. So counterproductive, like you say. Minister, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, and I really appreciate what you do on your podcast.
You as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.